In 2021, these three catchers mashed, combining for over 100 homers, but they did it in different ways. Here's how Salvador Perez, Yasmani Grandal, and Mike Zunino dominated the American League.
Ball is crushed. Center field.
Confidence, really believing in it.
Salvador Perez walks it off.
Historically, the catcher position has not been known for hitting, and last year was no exception. League-wide, catchers collectively had an 89 WRC+. Aside from pitchers, no other position came within 5 points. Some catchers like Jorge Alfaro and Dom Nunez put up over 250 plate appearances and had WRC+s south of 75, but the same couldn't be said about these three catchers. Let's start with the hardware winner, Salvador Perez. In 2021, Perez played an ungodly 161 games for the Kansas City Royals, tied for third with Vlad Guerrero Jr. in all of Major League Baseball. Of the 161 games, 124 of them were behind home plate. Perez took home his 4th Silver Slugger and finished 7th in MVP voting, thanks to his league-high 48 homers and 121 RBIs. However, Perez was actually the worst of the three catchers we're going to talk about today. Despite having the highest batting average at 273, he only had a 316 on base percentage thanks to a paltry 4.2 walk rate, the 12th worst in baseball in 2021 among hitters with at least 250 plate appearances. Perez's value also suffered because of his defense. This might surprise some people because of his 5 gold gloves, but defensive metrics do not look kindly at Perez. Last season, Perez was the worst framer in the league and the 2nd worst overall defensive catcher. Because of this, Perez only managed 3.4 F-WAR despite having 665 plate appearances and a 127 WRC+. Yasmani Grandal played 68 fewer games than Perez, but he actually outwarred him by 0.3 F-WAR, with 3.7. While some of this comes from better defense, Grandal's WRC+ was actually 32 points higher than Perez. With a 159 WRC+, Grandal was the 5th best hitter in the league last season. The gap between Perez and Grandal was the same as the gap between Perez and Jacob Stallings. If you were to only look at batting average and slugging, this would surprise you, as Grandal's 240 batting average and 520 slugging were both much lower than Perez's numbers. But then you turn to on-base percentage. Grandal had a mind-blowingly high 420 on-base percentage, third only to Juan Soto and Bryce Harper. Grandal's on-base percentage was a whopping 104 points higher than Salvador Perez. And this was due to his ridiculously high, league-leading 23.2% walk rate. His walk rate was almost 20 percentage points higher than Perez's. In fact, Grandal walked so much that he actually had 20 more walks than he did hits. What's even weirder is that through the All-Star break, Grandal had a 130 WRC+ in 62 games, and this was despite having a 188 batting average. In the second half of the season, despite missing a lot of time due to injury, Grandal managed to have a WRC+ over 200. Lastly, Mike Zunino was the best of the three catchers, but you wouldn't expect it when you look at his batting average. Zunino was similar to Grandal in the fact that he had a low batting average but a high WRC+. If you were to look solely at his 216 batting average, you would have never guessed that he was a good hitting catcher. But Zunino mashed. I know I've said that about Grandal and Perez, but if you thought Perez's 48 homers were impressive, you should actually be more impressed with Zunino's 33. Here's why. If Zunino had maintained his home run rate through the same number of plate appearances Perez had, Zunino would have actually finished with 11 more homers than Perez did. Zunino homered every 11.4 plate appearances, which means that if you went and saw the Rays play in a 3-game series in 2021, you probably saw a Zunino homer. And while Zunino didn't walk nearly as much as Grandal did, he walked twice as often as Perez did. Altogether, Zunino finished with a 134 WRC+. So while Perez took home the slugging hardware, it would be just as justifiable to give it to Zunino or Grandal. Zunino was the highest warring catcher of the three with 4.5. This was due largely to his elite framing with +8 framing runs. This placed him fittingly at 8th in the major leagues. Grandal finished with -0.8 framing runs, which was 39th best in the majors, while Perez finished dead last with -19.5 framing runs. So now that we've looked at all of that, I wanted to look more in depth at the differences between their plate approaches. As I mentioned, these three catchers all mashed, but they didn't do it in the same way. We've looked a little bit into plate discipline, but let's dive in a little more. Yasmani Grandal, for instance, was a very patient hitter, as you would have guessed with his elite walk rate. He only swung at pitches outside the zone 16.5% of the time. But what's interesting about Grandal is that he hardly swung at strikes either. In fact, Grandal had the lowest swing rate in all of baseball at 31.9%. This was 6 percentage points lower than the second lowest swing rate. However, when Grandal swung, he was making contact 77% of the time. This wasn't elite by any means, but Grandal seemed to only swing when he thought he could do damage. damage. Perez, on the other hand, swung a ton and made contact a ton. He had the third highest swing rate in all of the major leagues, swinging at 48% of pitches that were off the plate, but he still managed a higher contact rate than Grandal did. If you were to look at other free swingers, you'll find some mashers like Tim Anderson and Luis Robert, but you also find some slap hitters like Hanser Alberto and Harold Castro. Perez's strategy was much more of a see ball, hit ball approach, and it worked for him. And lastly, Zunino falls in between the two. While he had far better plate discipline than Perez, he was nowhere near the god tier of Grandal. Zunino made far less contact than Perez and Grandal, which makes his homer rate much more surprising. Zunino struck out 35% of the time, and if you combine his walk rate and his homer rate with his strikeout rate, Zunino was looking at the 3 true outcomes 53% of the time. While his 30.3% home run to fly ball ratio was the highest of the bunch, it wasn't too different from Perez or Grandal, so why was his home run rate so high? It's because Zunino hit the ball in the air a whopping 54% of the time. For reference, both Grandal and Perez both had fly ball rates at roughly 40%. So Zunino's strategy was hit it in the air and hit the ball hard. With Buster Posey retiring, the only catcher going into next season that was as good of a hitter as these three is Will Smith. So while they did it in their own way, all three of these American League catchers dominated at a position not known for slugging. And that's the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, like and subscribe, and leave us a comment which catcher you thought was better. We also make shorts, so check those out too. Thanks, bye.